The history and glory of horse racing here in Louisiana pretty much parallels that of the 108-year-old fairgrounds located in the heart of New Orleans. For more than a century, some of the greatest thoroughbreds and trainers of all time made the fairgrounds their winter home. But the history of racing itself goes back even further than that. In fact, there was a time when New Orleans was considered the horse racing capital of the world, a time before the fairgrounds, a time when racing was a gentleman's game based on the simple proposition that my horse can beat your horse. Founded by Bienville in 1718, New Orleans had already become a thriving southern community by the time the Louisiana Purchase was consummated in 1803. The city derived much of her wealth from the production of sugar cane. Most of the early sugar plantations, which fronted on the Father of Waters for miles above and below the city, were owned by descendants of 18th century French and Spanish settlers. Stately mansions sheltered families who in some instances could trace their ancestries back to and even beyond the golden days of Louis XIV. There had evolved a form of polite, cultured existence not equaled anywhere else on the American continent. They were the De Laurens, the De Marigny's, the Pluchets, and the Claibornes. They were aristocrats with a deep appreciation and love for the blue blood of the horse world known as the thoroughbred. By the early 1800s, horse racing had become one of the most popular pastimes in New Orleans. The first recognized track was built in 1825 near the battlefield of Chalmette, where just a few years earlier, Andrew Jackson had saved New Orleans from an invading British army. 12 years later, a second track was built in the area where Audubon Park is today. But the most famous of them all was the Old Metairie Racecourse, which during its heyday became one of the most famous tracks in the world. Old Metairie was in a class all by itself. Top caliber horses ran for purses of up to $10,000. Crowds of more than 20,000 filled the stands and lined the rails. Wealthy planters thought nothing of wagering $5,000 on the outcome of a single race. In the 10-year period preceding the war between the states, Metairie contributed countless pages to horse racing history books. April 1st, 1854 was one day that will be remembered forever. 4 champion thoroughbreds representing the best in Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Alabama were locked head-to-head in a $20,000 match race that took 8 miles and more than 16 minutes to decide the winner. From the onset, it was a 2-horse race between LeCompte, the pride of Louisiana, and Lexington, the great champion from Kentucky. Here's how the old Picayune newspaper reported on the outcome of the famous match race.
On the last lap, Lexington on the backstretch went to work in earnest, gradually closing the gap on LeCompte, both striving hard for supremacy and the pace increasing. Lexington locked LeCompte and they swung into the home stretch side by side, the excitement running high among the cheering thousands. Down they came, rushing forward like a torrent, each at the top of his speed, but the speed of Lexington was superior, and he shot past the judges' stand in front, winning the heat and the race.
And so Metairie became one of the most famous of all racetracks. But the glory that was Metairie soon would be nothing more than a cherished memory, a page in the history book. Years of war changed the face of the South. Proud New Orleans, once mighty mistress of the great Mississippi Valley, had been raped and ravaged. Many of her finest sons never returned from Shiloh, Bull Run, and Gettysburg. The Civil War also dealt a death blow to Metairie Racecourse. The owners of the track tried to make a comeback during Reconstruction, but there were financial problems, not to mention a breeding industry seriously impaired by 4 years of bloody battles. And so the track became yet another casualty of the war between the states. Appropriately enough, in 1872, the track was converted into a burial ground. Today, Metairie Cemetery is one of the most beautiful cemeteries in all of the United States. And a few old-timers still ask to be buried at the 8th pole or anywhere along the backstretch with a good view. While Metairie may have died, racing in Louisiana did not. On April 13, 1872, the Louisiana Jockey Club began holding races at a place called the Fairgrounds. Now, the Fairgrounds got its name prior to the Civil War. It had been the site for the annual Mechanics and Agricultural Fair, and so the name Fairgrounds seemed to fit. Racing in the 1870s survived, but that's about all. The Louisiana Jockey Club was plagued by financial difficulties brought on by carpetbaggers and Reconstruction. In 1880, the new Louisiana Jockey Club was formed with Duncan F. Kenner as president. Racing began to make a comeback. By 1886, the Fairgrounds was out of the red and showing a profit. That success prompted the construction of several new racetracks. It was fun for a while, but New Orleans, an always tolerant community, soon became fed up with horse racing. A once noble sport was being turned into a racket. A heavy concentration of bookmakers, Sunday racing, and talk of night racing prompted the state legislature to pass a bill outlawing all horse racing in Louisiana, effective the summer of 1908. Lieutenant Governor J.Y. Sanders summed it up.
There can be no doubt that racing as presently carried on in this community is demoralizing in its tendencies. Sunday racing, night racing, and racing enterprises that operate all year are intolerable nuisances.
Honest racing officials recognized the problems brought on by greed and corruption. They spent the next 6 years cleaning house and trying to convince legislators in Baton Rouge that racing deserved a second chance. Well, that second chance finally came on January 1st, 1915, when the ban on racing was repealed. This fabled age-old racetrack revived its glorious tradition when World War I was getting a good start in Europe. Nations would fall, dynasties would crumble, but like the symbolic oaks that tower high over the infield, the strength and vitality of this famous institution would live on long after the smoke of battle had cleared. The period from 1915 to 1930 went down in history as the golden age of the fairgrounds. One reason for racing's strong comeback in Louisiana was the legendary race mare Panzaretta. She was the Cinderella of her time, without a doubt the most popular horse to ever race at the historic fairgrounds. During her career, Panzaretta won 76 races, the most ever recorded by one of her sex. Her biggest victory came in a match race against world record holder Joe Blair. Racing fans from all over the United States and Mexico traveled to see the great race. Conceding her rival 10 pounds, Panzaretta took command at the 8th pole and drew away, sprinting 5 furlongs, or 5/8 of a mile, in 57 1/5 seconds, a new world record. While awaiting the start of the 1918 season, Panzaretta contracted pneumonia at the fairgrounds and died. She was buried in the infield halfway down the fairgrounds' long home stretch, gone but not forgotten. A year later, more tragedy. A few days before the opening of the 1919 season, the fairgrounds grandstand was completely destroyed by fire. A massive steel and wood structure, 365 feet long and 120 feet wide, the grandstand was originally built for Union Park in St. Louis. After racing was discontinued in Missouri, it was brought to New Orleans and erected at the fairgrounds in 1907. The fire had come at a bad time, what with the racing season set to open. But long before the ashes were cold, workers were busy putting up a temporary grandstand. They labored around the clock, finishing the job in only 3 days. And so the fairgrounds had survived yet another setback. The 1920s turned out to be a decade dominated by Black Gold and Colonel E.R. Bradley. In 1925, Bradley, a famous Kentucky horseman, bought the fairgrounds in hopes of making it the center of winter racing in the United States. Colonel Bradley was an innovative man. He introduced the mechanical starting gate and rubber riding suits for use by jockeys during inclement weather. He constructed new barns to provide cross ventilation, special showers, and spacious skylights. He also raced some of the best horses of his time, including Kentucky Derby Bubbling Over and Louisiana Derby Bag and Baggage. But the horse he loved the most was Black Gold. In 1924, Black Gold won the Louisiana Derby, the Kentucky Derby, the Ohio Derby, and just about every other big race he was entered in. Few horses over the years have captured the imagination of the racing public like Black Gold. According to local newspaper accounts, the flashy-looking Kentucky-bred colt attracted a record crowd the day he won the Louisiana Derby. That was 54 years ago. Black Gold was owned by a Cherokee Indian named Alfred Hoots. Now, as the story goes, Hoots had a prized race mare that once set a track record at the fairgrounds. He had hoped to take the mare to Kentucky to be bred to a fashionable stallion, but he became seriously ill. So Colonel Bradley granted Hoots' death wish by offering a free service to his stallion, the famous Black Tony. A year or so later, the mare had her baby, a jet black colt. Not long after that, oil was discovered on Hoots' homeland, making his widow, Rosa, very wealthy. So the colt was named, appropriately enough, Black Gold. Without question, Colonel Bradley provided New Orleans with some of its finest racing. He refused to settle for second best, even though the Depression and hard times were just around the corner. It was widely speculated that the good colonel lost $750,000 trying to maintain the fairgrounds image as the winter racing capital of the United States. Finally, he decided to unload the track before the bottom fell out. It was a time of financial uncertainty, a time when the populist movement in Louisiana was gaining strength.
The highway to Baton Rouge, who put up the hospital and built the school, who looked after shed kickers like you, the kingfish do.
He was the godfather of Louisiana politics, the protectorate of the oppressed masses, the guardian of their future. He was tough and at times arrogant, but always colorful and imaginative. No man before him had offered so much hope to the sharecropper, the laborer, the poor, the disadvantaged. He was a legend in his own time. He was the kingfish.
Here come the kingfish, kingfish.
And the kingfish ruled with an iron hand. His opponents, and there were many, labeled him a demagogue and tried to impeach him while he was governor. They say he ranted and raved his way into office, but the people loved him. For some reason which no one can explain, Long, during his 7 years as Tsar of Louisiana, pretty much let racing go its own way. Surprising for a man who seemingly wanted to control everything. Huey Long actually helped racing by cracking down on illegal gambling. In August 1928, Governor Long secretly mobilized National Guardsmen and sent them to highlight clubs in St. Bernard Parish where unconcealed and illegal gambling was being conducted. Long used this tactic time and time again in his war on gambling houses. Horse racing, he once said, was an honorable sport. By the time Long was assassinated in 1935, racing was also a troubled sport once again. In the 1930s, bankruptcies and bank closings were in the headlines nearly every day. A threatened national calamity followed the first inauguration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on March 4th, 1933, when all of the banks in the United States closed their doors. This came as another blow to racing, forcing the fairgrounds to shut down briefly. A year later, the historic old track was sold because of financial difficulties. But nothing really changed. The Depression continued to take its toll on racing, reaching a low point in the late 1930s. Finally, in 1940, it was announced the track would be sold as a real estate development. Plans called for the grandstand and all of the barns to be leveled. New homes would then be built on the 120-acre site, covering the graves of Black Gold and Panzaretta. In an 11th-hour move to save the historic fairgrounds, a group of New Orleans businessmen and sportsmen, led by Sylvester LeBreau Jr., William J. Hellis, Anthony Pelletieri, and Herbert J. Schwartz, formed the Fairgrounds Corporation and purchased the track. But there were still some rocky times ahead. In 1945, the fairgrounds voluntarily suspended racing to conserve fuel and manpower in an all-out war effort. On August 14, 1945, it was over. Peace at last. Following World War II, horse racing in Louisiana made yet another comeback. More than 20,000 people packed the fairgrounds for the opening of the 1945-46 season. So in New Orleans, anyway, racing had returned to its spot not as the sport of kings, but rather as the king of sports. In 1948, the fairgrounds celebrated its Jubilee season, 75 years old and still going strong despite 2 world wars, the Depression, reform movements, a devastating fire, corrupt politicians, and even crooked horsemen. But racing survived because of the honesty and concern of a handful of good men and because of the courageous, high-spirited animal known as the thoroughbred. The first post-war meeting was held in late 1945 from November 22nd to December 31st. During that time, 299 races were run at the fairgrounds and purse distribution totaled $241,000. By the 1957 meeting from January 1st through March 9th, 481 races were run and purse distribution totaled $1,150,175. Slowly but surely, the historic fairgrounds, under the guidance of John Letelier Sr., Anthony Pelletieri, and General Manager Gar Moore, was beginning to live up to its past tradition. 1957 also was the beginning, unspectacular as it was, of a racing career of another horse which was to become one of the most popular figures in the history of fairgrounds racing. In 6 seasons, a horse named Tenacious scored 20 victories with 16 seconds, 17 thirds, and lifetime earnings of $261,000. Better records have been achieved, but seldom has a horse become so dominant a fixture at any track as was Tenacious at the fairgrounds. Bred and owned by Mrs. Joe W. Brown, Tenacious won the New Orleans Handicap twice. He won the Louisiana Handicap 3 times. Tenacious was one of more than 30 stakes winners campaigned by the Brown stable.
I've been around the fairgrounds for more than 40 years, and if I had to pick out any one individual or one individual outfit, it would have to be Mr. Joe Brown, the stable of Joe Brown. He had so many good horses that he brought here that won derbies and handicaps such as Gigantic and Matagorda and Dapper Delegate and Kentucky Sherry winning the derbies. Had Red Camellia, and Tenacious won the New Orleans Handicap here twice. Had Cabildo. Cabildo beat I.O., his stablemate. And the following year, Cabildo was second to a horse called Diplomat Way here. That was Mr. Harvey Pelche. And also Green Hornet won a New Orleans Handicap for Joe Brown. Well, that time was very exciting for me, especially. I was a lot younger man at that time, but we did have a lot of good race horses here and a lot of good jockeys, a lot of good trainers, and Fairgrounds was a buzzing place all the time. It was really humming, and it was quite exciting to come to the Fairgrounds. It always was.
Without question, the 25 years following the end of World War II will be remembered as the glory years of the fairgrounds. Champion Whirlaway raced here, so did Kentucky Derby winner Carryback and the great handicap star Yorktown. Some of the best jockeys of all time also graced the fairgrounds winner circle, legendary jockeys such as Eddie Arcaro and the ageless Willie Shoemaker. But if the 1950s and 60s were good years, the 70s were even better. In 1977, local businessman Joseph Dorniak Jr. and financier Louis Roussel Jr. purchased controlling interest in the fairgrounds, and they made a promise to return New Orleans to its rightful place as the racing capital of the Deep South. So far, they've lived up to that promise. They've raised purses and spent more than $5 million improving the track. As a result, the big-name stables are beginning to come back, and virtually every betting record has been shattered. For the historic old fairgrounds, you might say it's the dawning of a new era.